Picture the view from a commercial flight descending into Queenstown. Through the oval window, an unbroken wilderness unfolds below. Jagged mountain ridges draped in snow. River valleys carved deep into gray schist. Forests so dense and uninterrupted they appear from altitude as a single dark organism breathing across the land. There is no city down there. No suburb. No light. For minutes the plane descends and still there is nothing human in the frame. Then, finally, a town materializes at the edge of a glacial lake. Compact, almost apologetic in scale. Pressed against the mountains as though the wilderness has merely granted it temporary permission to exist. This is New Zealand, a nation of approximately 5.3 million people distributed across 268,000 square kilometers of land. By raw mathematics, that produces a population density of around 20 people per square kilometer, a figure lower than France, lower than Germany, lower than the United Kingdom, lower even than the United States. But the mathematics conceals a more striking reality. The actual inhabited surface of New Zealand is not the full landmass. Approximately 80% of the country is, by any functional definition, empty, uninhabited, unfarmed in any dense sense, and largely inaccessible to ordinary human settlement. Nearly 1 in 3 New Zealanders lives in a single city, Auckland. The top 4 urban areas account for more than half the entire national population. The rest of the country stretches out in staggering, silent space. This is not a coincidence. It is not merely the result of low immigration or modest birth rates. The emptiness of New Zealand is the product of forces that began operating 80 million years ago. Tectonic, biological, geological, and historical forces that conspired to produce a landscape both extraordinarily beautiful and fundamentally hostile to dense human habitation. Understanding why 80% of this country remains empty requires going back not just to the first Polynesian canoe that touched its shores, but to the moment when the land itself was torn from a supercontinent and cast adrift across the Southern Ocean. 3 questions demand answers. Why does a country the size of the United Kingdom hold fewer people than the state of Colorado? Why do those people cluster on the edges rather than spreading through the interior? And what does that emptiness actually mean? For the land, for the people who live beside it, and for the future of a nation built at the boundary of 2 colliding worlds. 80 million years ago, there was no New Zealand. There was instead a vast southern supercontinent called Gondwana, a mass of land that incorporated what is now Antarctica, Australia, South America, Africa, and a long continental fragment that geologists would eventually name Zealandia. Around 85 million years ago, Zealandia began to rift away from the Australian portion of Gondwana, moving eastward across the Proto-Pacific Ocean at the geological pace of centimeters per year. The separation was slow, but inexorable. As the continental crust stretched and thinned during the rifting process, much of Zealandia began to subside below sea level. By approximately 25 million years ago, most of Zealandia had sunk, 94% of the continent, a landmass roughly half the size of Australia, lay beneath the ocean. Only 2 elevated fragments protruded above the waves, what we now call the North Island and the South Island. The rest of the 8th continent, as modern geologists have formally recognized it, remains submerged beneath the Tasman Sea and the South Pacific, mapped in full only as recently as 2023 through a comprehensive geological survey by the GNS Science Institute. It is the world's largest submerged continental fragment, and the 2 islands of New Zealand are, in essence, its mountaintops. This near submersion had a consequence that would shape everything that followed. When Zealandia finally separated from Gondwana, it carried with it a biological cargo, ancient flora and fauna inherited from the supercontinent. But unlike continental landmasses that remained connected through land bridges, Zealandia was completely isolated by ocean. No new mammalian species could colonize it. No land predators arrived. The ecological development of New Zealand proceeded along an entirely different evolutionary trajectory from the rest of the planet. Birds evolved to fill ecological niches that mammals occupy everywhere else. The kiwi became flightless because there was nothing on the ground to flee from. Giant moa browsed through forests where deer and cattle would roam in other parts of the world. More than 80% of New Zealand's original plant species exist nowhere else on Earth. The country's isolation did not just shape its culture or its economy, it shaped the DNA of its trees. The collision that built the mountains was still coming. Around 5 million years ago, the relative motion between the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate intensified. In the South Island, the Pacific Plate began riding up over the Australian Plate along what is now the Alpine Fault, a 600-kilometer scar running the length of the island. The Southern Alps rose from this collision at a rate extraordinary by geological standards, some estimates suggesting the range is still rising by as much as 10 millimeters per year, even as erosion strips its surface. The result is a mountain barrier of exceptional scale for an island this size. Peaks above 3,700 meters, glaciers descending from ice fields, and a rain shadow that transforms the landscape from dense rainforest on one side to near desert on the other within the space of 100 kilometers. That mountain spine is the primary physical reason why New Zealand is empty. The Southern Alps are not merely scenic, they are a wall. To understand the spatial logic of New Zealand's emptiness, consider its terrain in precise terms. The South Island covers 151,000 square kilometers, making it one of the larger islands on Earth. But the Southern Alps run almost its entire length, and on either side of the main divide, the remaining lowland is narrow, fragmented, and in many places geologically active. The West Coast, a thin strip between the mountains and the Tasman Sea, receives more than 6 meters of rainfall annually in some locations, making it one of the wettest inhabited regions in the Southern Hemisphere. The terrain is steep, the soil shallow, the rivers powerful and prone to flooding. Settlement there was never going to scale. The Canterbury Plains on the eastern side offer the most significant flat agricultural land on the South Island, and this is where most South Island settlement is concentrated. Around Christchurch, in a broad alluvial plain that exists only because rivers carrying eroded mountain material have built it up over millennia. Beyond those plains, the high country stretches into a landscape of tussock grasslands, rock, and wine that resists dense habitation as effectively as a desert. The North Island presents a different challenge. While it lacks the scale of the Southern Alps, it contains one of the most volcanically active regions in the world. The Taupo volcanic zone runs diagonally across the center of the island, incorporating Lake Taupo, the caldera of a supervolcano whose Oruano eruption approximately 26,500 years ago was the largest volcanic event on Earth in the past 70,000 years. The landscape that eruption produced is geologically unstable and poor in agricultural soils across much of the interior. Major eruptions in the historical period. Tawera in 1886, which buried several villages and killed over 150 people, demonstrated that this volcanism is not dormant. It remains active, and it profoundly shapes where people can and cannot build permanent communities. The Haikarangi subduction zone, running offshore along the east coast of the North Island, presents perhaps the most consequential long-term geological constraint. According to GNS Science, New Zealand's primary Earth Science Research Institution, the Haikarangi zone is capable of generating a magnitude 9 or greater earthquake, an event comparable in scale to the 2011 Tohoku disaster in Japan. Modeling of such a rupture suggests tens of thousands of fatalities and the displacement of hundreds of thousands more. Simultaneously, the Alpine Fault in the South Island carries a roughly 29% probability of rupturing in the next 50 years, based on paleoseismic evidence of its 12-year return period. New Zealand does not merely sit on an unstable geology. It sits on two converging systems, each capable of reshaping the habitable map of the country within a matter of minutes. Only 33% of New Zealand's total land area is classified as flat or gently rolling, suitable, in principle, for agriculture or urban development. The remainder is steep hill country or mountain terrain. Of that flat third, a significant portion is legally protected under conservation legislation or is otherwise unsuitable for dense development due to flooding risk, volcanic hazard, or soil quality. The result is a country in which the available space for human settlement is far more constrained than its total land area implies. When the Polynesian ancestors of the Maori arrived in New Zealand, current scholarly consensus, supported by archaeological evidence and radiocarbon dating, places this arrival at approximately 1250 to 1300 CE. They found a land that was not merely uninhabited but biologically unlike anywhere else on Earth. There were no land mammals apart from two species of bat. The dominant large animals were birds, including the 11 species of moa, the largest of which stood 3.5 meters tall. The forests were ancient and dense. The rivers ran cold from snowmelt. The Maori settlement that developed over the following 5 centuries was concentrated on coastlines and river mouths, a distribution pattern that would prove remarkably persistent through every subsequent wave of human arrival. Estimates of the pre-European Maori population vary significantly, ranging from 100,000 to perhaps 200,000 or more at the time of European contact in the late 18th century. Even at the higher estimates, this represents extraordinarily low density for a habitable landmass. The interior was known, traversed, and in many areas spiritually significant, but it was not permanently settled at scale. The mountains, the volcanic plateau, and the dense forest of the interior remained, in practice, barriers to permanent human occupation. European colonization, which began in earnest following the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, introduced the pastoral economy that would define New Zealand's land use for the next century and a half. British settlers did not come to build industrial cities. They came to farm. The sheep and cattle economy that developed spread across the country's grasslands and hill country. Not human bodies, but livestock, numbering at their peak in the 1980s above 70 million sheep in a country of 3.5 million people. That ratio, roughly 20 sheep per person, represented an agricultural system that occupied enormous land areas while requiring minimal human settlement. The farming economy that built New Zealand's colonial prosperity was, by its nature, an economy of vast, lightly inhabited space. Urbanization accelerated through the 20th century, and by the present day, 87% of New Zealanders live in urban areas. The rural economy contracted, farms consolidated, and the interior regions that had supported modest agricultural communities began to depopulate. Today, New Zealand has more sheep than people. Approximately 23.6 million sheep to 5.3 million humans. But that sheep-to-person ratio has fallen dramatically from its historical peak as land use patterns shifted and international wool markets declined. The pastoral industry still occupies roughly 45% of New Zealand's agricultural land, but it does so with decreasing numbers of people. The paradox at the heart of modern New Zealand is this: a country with abundant land and minimal population density is simultaneously experiencing a severe housing and infrastructure crisis concentrated in a handful of cities. Auckland, home to nearly 1.55 million people as of 2025, has become one of the least affordable cities in the developed world by house price to income ratio. The city sprawls across a volcanic field, itself dotted with 53 potentially active volcanoes, on a narrow isthmus between 2 harbors, constrained in every direction by water, hills, and protected land. The housing crisis is not a resource problem. There is no shortage of land in New Zealand. The shortage is of usable, well-located, infrastructurally connected land in the specific places where people want and need to live. The mountains do not care that Auckland is overcrowded. The volcanic plateau does not redistribute itself to accommodate suburban expansion. The fundamental mismatch between where New Zealanders cluster and where their geography allows them to live is not a policy failure in isolation. It is a structural consequence of the same topographic and tectonic forces that have defined New Zealand's spatial logic for millions of years. The concentration of population in geologically active zones compounds this risk. Wellington, the capital, sits directly on the Wellington Fault, capable of generating a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake, and within the potential tsunami inundation zone of a Hikurangi subduction event. Christchurch, the South Island's largest city, was devastated by earthquakes in 2010 and 2011, killing 185 people and causing damage assessed at approximately 20 billion New Zealand dollars. The city was rebuilt on its original site, not because the geological risk was resolved, but because the economics and culture of place are not easily relocated. The pattern is consistent across New Zealand's history. Settlement concentrates in specific coastal and lowland zones because those are the only zones viable for dense human habitation. Hazard is accepted because the alternatives, dispersed settlement across terrain that cannot support it, are not economically or practically viable. The emptiness of the interior is not a choice in any meaningful sense. It is a geological verdict. The most common misconception about New Zealand's empty spaces is that they represent wasted or underutilized land, that they could be developed, populated, or more intensively farmed if not for environmental regulation or conservative planning policies. This misreads the nature of the emptiness fundamentally. Approximately 33% of New Zealand's land, more than 8.6 million hectares, is formally protected under conservation legislation managed primarily by the Department of Conservation. This protected estate includes 13 national parks, dozens of forest parks, and thousands of smaller reserves. It is not empty in any ecological sense. It is among the most biodiversity-rich temperate land on Earth, home to species with no living relatives anywhere else on the planet. The kakapo, the world's heaviest parrot, flightless and nocturnal, survives only in protected island sanctuaries. The tuatara, a reptile that split from its closest relatives during the Triassic period 250 million years ago, exists naturally only in New Zealand. The biodiversity that New Zealand carries is disproportionate to its land area precisely because its isolation preserved evolutionary trajectories that the rest of the world's ecosystems eventually overrode. Beyond protected areas, much of the remaining unsettled land is simply incapable of supporting agriculture at any economically meaningful scale. High country tussock lands are thin-soiled and subject to erosion. Alpine zones above the treeline are climatically unsuitable for most human activity. Fiordland, the spectacular southwestern corner of the South Island, receives rainfall in some locations exceeding 9 meters per year, sustains a landscape of glaciated valleys and ancient beech forest, and supports a human population so small it barely registers in census data. It is not conservation policy that keeps Fiordland empty. It is rain, rock, and the sheer physiological difficulty of existing there. The so-called emptiness is also a structural economic asset. New Zealand's agriculture, heavily export-oriented, depends on marketing a national brand of environmental quality. The film industry, the Lord of the Rings productions brought the landscape to global attention, generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually partly because the country appears, on screen and in reality, as a pre-modern wilderness. The tourism sector, before the disruptions of the 2020s, contributed nearly $20 billion annually to the economy, drawing visitors specifically for the experience of encountering landscapes that look nothing like a densely inhabited country. The emptiness is not just scenery. It is an industry. New Zealand in the coming decades faces a convergence of pressures that will test the relationship between its concentrated human settlements and its vast, uninhabited spaces in ways without historical precedent. Climate change is already altering the hydrology of the country in measurable terms. Glacier retreat in the Southern Alps is accelerating. The Franz Josef and Fox glaciers, among the most rapidly descending glaciers in the world in the 20th century, have retreated dramatically, and hydrological modeling suggests continued loss through the 21st century. The rivers fed by glacial meltwater in summer will eventually carry less water. The agricultural systems in Canterbury and Otago that depend on irrigation from those rivers will face water stress conditions not experienced in the historical period of European settlement. At the same time, extreme weather events, already intensifying in frequency and magnitude, are exposing vulnerabilities in the infrastructure of a country where roads and communities are built in river valleys alongside unstable slopes and on coastal margins. The flooding events in Auckland in early 2023, which killed 6 people and caused damage exceeding $1 billion New Zealand dollars, demonstrated that even the country's largest city is structurally exposed to weather extremes in ways that its infrastructure was not designed to manage. The seismic threat does not diminish. The Alpine Fault last ruptured in a major event approximately in 1717 based on paleoseismic evidence from trees, sediments, and offset landforms. A recurrence interval of roughly 300 years, combined with the existing age of the last rupture, places the statistical probability of a significant event within the next half-century at levels that emergency management agencies treat with sustained seriousness. A rupture in the magnitude 8 range would cut the South Island's road and communication networks, isolate Christchurch and other eastern communities, and affect the structural integrity of infrastructure across a vast portion of the island. The population pressure in Auckland is unlikely to ease. Demographic modeling suggests continued growth toward 2 million and beyond within the current century, expanding an urban footprint into volcanic and coastal zones that carry inherent risk. The city's geographic constraints. The isthmus, the harbors, the volcanic field beneath its surface, mean that densification is not merely a policy choice, but a geological imperative. There is a particular quality to the silence of the New Zealand interior that is difficult to articulate in practical terms. Stand on the Mackenzie Basin on a clear winter night, with the Southern Alps white to the east and the Milky Way arching across a sky unmediated by light pollution from any city, and the impression is not merely of natural beauty, it is of geological time, of the deep processes that built this place, that nearly drowned it, that thrust it above the ocean and populated it with creatures that evolved in total isolation from the trajectory of life everywhere else. New Zealand is not empty because its people failed to occupy it. It is not empty because of any failure of ambition or imagination. It is empty because 80 million years of geological and biological history produced a landscape that was always going to resist dense human habitation. Steep, volcanic, seismically active, ecologically fragile, and separated from the nearest continent by 2,000 kilometers of open ocean. The 20% that humans occupy is remarkable not because it is small, but because making it habitable at all required extraordinary persistence. In the contemporary world, where the language of land use is dominated by development and optimization, there is something worth examining carefully in a country that is structurally prevented from filling itself in. The mountains that wall off the interior are not obstacles to be engineered around. The fault lines are not problems awaiting a policy solution. The empty spaces are not failures. They are the record of deep time, the geological autobiography of a continent that almost vanished, that rebuilt itself through collision, and that supports human life in its narrow coastal margins as though on sufferance. Every city in New Zealand is built on borrowed ground. The terms of that borrowing are written not in any treaty or title deed, but in the rock itself. In the fault plains, the volcanic vents, the alpine ridges, and the deep ocean trenches that surround every side. New Zealand's emptiness is not a problem awaiting a solution. It is the oldest fact about the place. Please subscribe our channel for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching.